Hello, everybody. And amazingly, we have just about reached the end of the term. We are at the final lecture of new material for Earth 10. And this lecture addresses more specifically the Antarctic connection to climate change, which we learned more about the general science and principles behind during the previous lecture. The first half of this lecture talks about how Antarctic research has allowed an extensive record of Earth's climate to be established via the use of ice cores. And during the second half of the lecture, we'll talk about how climate change has affected Antarctica, how it has caused ice sheet collapse and declines in krill population, and so forth. So before I launch into that, here's a summary of the remaining work for the course. Your final lab is due Friday, and you don't have a lab due next week. Meanwhile, the second reading assignment is due on March 14th, which is the Sunday of Dead Week, and that's right before finals week. That's also when I'd like you to have any extra credit write-ups submitted, as well as when I'd like to hear any questions or queries about missing work or anything else that might need attention before I submit grades, because I submit grades very, very soon after final exams. The final itself is going to be open from Monday, March 15th at midnight until Friday, March 19th at 11:59 p.m. California time. And I'll be releasing a study guide next week, as well as doing review. I need to figure out exactly how I'm going to do review, and I will announce the exact plan. I think I will probably, I think what I will do is I will record the two lectures separately, but then be present for office hours also. And I'll have the slides ready, but but one review lecture will be on kind of covering the climate change stuff, as well as maybe summary of pre-midterm stuff. And then there'll be another one just for stuff we've learned. Actually, how I'll do it is I'll have one composed of stuff we've learned since the midterm, and one composed before the and one composed of material from before the midterm, because pre-midterm material will be on the exam, so I will make a short lecture recapping some of that. And I also wanted to mention that there is a colloquium today. Actually, I'm recording this on Thursday. I apologize for the lateness. But there's a talk on sulfur isotopes by Dr. Lubna Shawar of MIT. And we're learning a little bit about isotopes in this lecture. If people have found it difficult to get to these talks, but they're still interested, I can, if you remind me, like if you send me an email, I can ask my department and possibly figure out if there's any recordings available of any of the presentations. So just shoot me an email to remind me about that. And the first half of this lecture will be about Antarctica's role as a repository of climate data. And lecture 16B, the second video, will detail the effects of anthropogenic climate change. Now, in the past lecture, I mentioned that the current increase in carbon dioxide emissions has taken atmospheric CO2 outside of a range, outside of what's considered the normal range. And you might be wondering how we have any idea of what the normal range would be if we can't go back in time and sample the air. It turns out that in a way, we actually can sample the air. That is one specific method that involves the ice cores taken from Antarctica. But overall, the science to determining humidity and temperatures and wind patterns and other data related to climate is known as paleoclimatology. And it is the science of studying greenhouse gas emissions and how they interact with Milankovitch cycles, plate tectonics, and other factors to affect climate in the past. And likewise, their goal is also to figure out how that affected life on Earth, possibly to draw parallels with the consequences of climate change in the present. And in fact, that's one reason why paleoclimatology has become very much so a valuable field of science. And it's very valuable that we have this data, because it is giving us a sense of just how out of whack we are putting the planet, to put it in a not particularly scientific way, but that's what comes to mind. Of course, some people are willfully ignorant of their research, but you can lead a horse to water, yada, yada, yada. Anyhow, you may have heard the term proxy before, and that might be in a financial or business context. Somebody sends a proxy to a meeting to conduct business and vote for them because they can't be there themselves. And we no longer have the whole ancient atmosphere to sample, but we can find evidence that can give us clues as to what the climate in ancient times was like. And paleoclimatology very much heavily relies on proxies. But in one instance, with the Antarctic ice, we actually do end up being able to actually find ancient air and sample it. So we'll talk about the various proxy methods first. The measurings we take of other occurrences in the rock record or sediment or fossils or whatnot that we then interpret to obtain information about the climate when those formations were made or when the organisms that are fossilized were alive, making educated guesses about past climates. And we touched on one of these previously, actually, and those are varves. And remember that if glaciers are present in an area with lakes, the meltwater melting from the glacier will carry some fine-grained sediment, some fine-grained and very light-colored sediment that has a lot of quartz in it, and that is known as outwash. Now, in lakes fed by the glacial runoff, a pattern will form where in the summer, when the glaciers are melting more because the sun is more effectively heating them, the lake will be full of light-colored outwash, the light layers in this picture here. And in the winter, the lake will instead be full of dark-colored matter. That's just the organic matter forming in the lake itself, because in the winter, the glacier is melting less and less sediment is coming from it. And we can study patterns in varves to see how glaciation changes, to see if glaciers are getting larger or smaller in a given section of time represented by the sediment record we find. If a varve pattern is present, and as we go from older samples to younger samples, we observe the black stripes getting wider, we can make a guess that it was getting colder because winter was colder and longer, and during more of the year, there was relatively little glacial runoff because the glaciers weren't melting. The glaciers were very, very stable and possibly getting bigger. And we can also look at ocean sediments. And the big reason we do this is to look at fossils of Foraminifera, which is a type of phytoplankton and one of the varieties that puts calcite or calcium carbonate in its shells. And calcium carbonate has oxygen in it, and as we'll find out, the oxygen isotopes can tell us a lot about glaciation. And similarly, cave formations are also made of calcium carbonate. And the general term for stalactites, stalagmites, columns, and even bacon, which there is such a thing with cave formations, those various limestone cave formations are known as speleothems, and they grow in layers as well. They grow in layers that can be traced to different layers being traced to different years. And so changes in the isotope ratios can be observed over time, and we'll talk more about isotope ratios and what that tells us about climate during this lecture. Meanwhile, you may have also come across dendrochronology in the form of people looking at tree rings and counting them to figure out how old a tree is. And many long-lived tree species produce a pattern of rings, and the lighter layers will alternate with the dark layers. The light layers form during spring and early summer, while the darker rings form during late summer and fall, and with some calculations, it can be determined how old the trees are. And the relative thicknesses of the layers tells us a lot. Trees can live for hundreds or even thousands of years, and if the age can be reasonably well determined, scientists can over time figure out which years had longer winters or longer summers and make estimates as to how yearly average temperatures were changing or how much precipitation was changing. And this has been really useful, for example, in the southwestern US to track a proposed period of drying that occurred and drove many of the native peoples in what are now Arizona and New Mexico out of their homes, out to wetter areas. The area dried out a lot, and they can observe this in the tree ring patterns of long-lived tree species from the area. And speaking of plants, we also talked about plant fossils when talking about plate tectonics before. And it turns out that the same distribution patterns that helped us unlock the mysteries of plate tectonics can also tell us about past climates. And if plants are known to be associated with a particular environment, like swamp plants or rainforest plants, or even just significant plant growth at all in the case of Antarctica, that can tell us about what the climate was like. They found fern fossils in Antarctica, and that told scientists that for whatever reason, Antarctica had once had a climate that could support such plants, as opposed to being borderline uninhabitable now. So these methods all involve not directly measuring the atmosphere itself, but using other evidence we have to make guesses about what the atmosphere was like and how it changed while, say, the sediment was being deposited, or while the fossils were formed, or while the tree was growing. There is one more direct method we have, though, and that is ice cores, and that's where Antarctica comes in. And remember from the glaciers unit that glaciers are formed from snow that is compacted over the years. Snow, when it first settles, is about 90% air by volume, and it has a lot of open space at that point, but that open space will start to disappear as snow begins to compact under its own weight. And over time, less and less space will be taken up by the air. So in contrast to snow, glacial ice is very compressed. Glacial ice has only 20% of its volume still taken up by air bubbles. And that's a dramatic decrease. And importantly, when there are those few air bubbles, the air bubbles become impermeable. They're no longer connected, and air can't really travel between bubbles or between the bubbles and outside of the ice. The air cannot escape and the air gets trapped, and that actually allows us to sample ancient air in glacial ice. What happens is that we drill into an ice sheet, and down below the point where the ice is compacted enough for the air bubbles to be trapped, to be unable to mix with the more recent atmospheres, we can actually take the ice core and sample the air bubbles to get a sense of what the atmospheric composition was like. How many parts per million of CO2 or methane or other greenhouse gas we're interested in were present, for example. And it's relatively easy to calculate how old each layer of ice is, and as a result, we can analyze the bubbles and figure out how old they are and compare ice bubbles at one point in the ice core to those, say, lower down, which are going to be older. And the record of ice in Antarctica is thousands of years old. It's over 800,000 years old, and that's 8 times the length of time represented by the Greenland ice sheets. So no disrespect to Greenland, obviously, but the Antarctic ice sheet is a really, really valuable climate record. And ice cores are taken from high points on the glacier. They're taken from the top of the dome from which the ice is flowing away in every direction. And that's because the accumulation of snow is highest here, and that means that the glacial ice will compress more quickly. Now, how do we figure out how old the ice is? We have to make some assumptions, but we have a pretty good idea of what the accumulation rate of snow in Antarctica is. On average, it's about 0.05 meters a year, or 5 centimeters a year. And that's a bit more than your fingernails are going to grow in an entire year, on average. The snow in Greenland does accumulate faster, actually, at about half a meter or 50 centimeters a year. And some of that's because the Greenland ice sheet is not right at the North Pole. It's further south, so it's getting a little more. Greenland is getting a little more precipitation than the South Pole of it. The South Pole of Antarctica is by quite a bit. But I mentioned before that the Greenland ice sheet is smaller and not as thick, and so it has a shorter record. It's generally also less stable than the East Antarctic ice sheet, and that is especially true now with anthropogenic global warming. Not to mention, the Greenland ice sheet is surrounded by countries that have factories and transportation centers and produce greenhouse gas emissions. It's not right next to Moscow and New York City, but it's closer to Moscow and New York City than, say, Antarctica is to Buenos Aires or Cape Town. Antarctica is a lot more isolated from industrial centers that have point sources of pollution than Greenland is. And the reason we care about that is because we want something that is a good representation of average global carbon dioxide emissions. We want air that is pretty well mixed, that isn't being unduly influenced by a polluting source like a coal-fired power plant. We want it to be air that's pretty well mixed, and where the sources of carbon dioxide and methane and other gases are farther away. Antarctica is really far from any industrial cities, and it's also doesn't have the inland of Antarctica does not have much biological activity at all. In any case, whether you're in Antarctica or Greenland, the age of the ice can be determined from the accumulation rate, or sometimes data from the glacier flow rate can be used also. And there's something that has to be considered that's really important. The ice does not become compact enough to trap air until it is buried about 50 meters deep. And when scientists are figuring out how old the ice is, they need to correct it for a time lag. And it can be fairly easily done by dividing 50 meters by the relevant accumulation rate. And that's going to produce an amount of time. That's basically the amount of time that passes between the snow first falling and the snow being compacted enough to trap air. And that correction needs to be added on to the time. And the key point with this is that the air trapped inside of the ice is going to be younger than the ice itself. Because, again, the snow, once it falls, is going to take time to be buried at 50 meters, and that could actually take decades or centuries for that to happen. And the air trapped in the ice is the air present when the ice was buried deep enough to become compacted and when it basically got sealed off, not when the ice first fell. When the snow first fell, it was fluffy snow. It's over 90% air, and air can get in and out as it pleases. But decades or centuries later, when it's compacted enough, then it's trapping the air that's present those decades or centuries later. And so we need to do that correction. And you have to consider the fact that the air trapped is going to be younger than the ice itself. As long as we keep that correction into account, then we can quite accurately obtain atmospheric chemical data from the air bubbles in ice cores, which is pretty amazing, I think. And ice cores can actually be taken from any stable glacier. It doesn't necessarily have to be an ice sheet, but the ice sheets like those in Antarctica are most useful because they are thick and provide a really far going back continuous record. And Antarctica is also a valuable repository of data for a number of reasons related to its uniqueness as a continent. And unique is overused, but there is no place quite like Antarctica. For one thing, carbon dioxide and methane concentrations are very heavily influenced by biological activity, which we talked about during the last lecture. And there is very little of that on the interior of the Antarctic continent. There's not much in the way of fossil fuels forming or forests growing or decomposition producing methane. There's not really permafrost in Antarctica either, because Antarctica doesn't really have soil at all. You form permafrost where you have soil, and Antarctica has very little soil. So the fact that Antarctica in the inland where the snow is accumulating is kind of biologically barren is actually really good for this, because you're not getting much influence from Antarctica. You're actually getting a really well-mixed sample of air that's a pretty good approximate of what global air was like. And so so the air bubbles in the Antarctic ice cores end up being a pretty good representation of global air in that way. And like I mentioned before, Antarctica is far from cities. It's far from factories, areas with a lot of plane or road traffic. You don't really have planes flying over Antarctica, except for the small number of scientist planes. And in general, that means that you don't have to worry about oversampling CO2 from a specific source of CO2 that would be just pumping it into the air right in Antarctica. It gives you a sense of what the overall global climate was like and how much that was influenced by CO2. Also, Antarctica doesn't have a ton of volcanoes either, and especially not near the interior, so that helps also. You do have Mount Erebus, but that's closer to the edge, and not as close to where most of the samples are taken from, although you do have to consider volcanoes also. And the long record available from the very, very thick ice sheet is a big bonus, because again, we don't have just thousands of years of air samples anywhere else. It's also very easy to cross-check in Antarctica because the ice sheet is so widespread and so stable, by and large, compared to Greenland or compared to glaciers elsewhere. And so ice cores taken from different points in the ice sheets can be correlated to see if the bubbles at the same depth in the ice, but in different locations, have different properties. And this is important because this makes it less likely that your data are going to be a fluke. It helps the reproducibility. It helps solidify that your data is something that hypothetically a different scientist with no professional or economic or academic affiliation to you could go and find something similar. And it helps us determine that a spike in CO2 that we see in one ice core isn't just a fluke. We can see if that spike is present as we go up one ice core versus another one taken from elsewhere on the ice sheet. And here are some of the ice core samples, and you can see that they're not all from the interior. And part of that is because I mentioned that in Antarctica, we get the ice shelves out on the ocean because snow is still accumulating at the coasts in many cases. So that actually means that you can sometimes get reasonably good cores near the ocean, as you can see here. But in general, a lot of the core sites are from the interior, like near Lake Vostok and near the point of inaccessibility, and just far from the ocean where you have thick ice. And you also notice that these are taken at high points. You can see these lines represent approximations of the ice streams, and you can see that they've picked points in many cases where the ice streams are all flowing in separate directions. Like I mentioned, that's where you have snow accumulating. Anyhow, ice cores can also provide several ways to make educated guesses about average global temperatures of past years. For one thing, through CO2, through the amount of CO2 present. But one method actually involves directly probing the temperature of the ice itself. And not all snow is actually going to be the same temperature. It can be any temperature below the freezing point of water. And strangely enough, layers of snow, when you pile them up, function as something of a thermos. Layers of snow on the top actually insulate the layers of snow underneath them from the atmosphere and help them stay a consistent temperature. And a lot of this has to do with the high heat capacity of water, meaning that water can absorb quite a bit of energy without changing temperature much dramatically, and in the case of ice, without melting. And so a correction does have to be made, but if those corrections are made, it's possible to use the temperature of the ice borehole to actually make estimates about, say, the winter air temperatures and correlate temperatures at different depths with different years. So what they do is they send a probe down that measures the temperature at, say, 10 meters below and 20, or more like 100 meters below and 200 meters below, and compares them. And so on this diagram, this borehole temperature reading shows it shows a drop in temperature actually with a period called the Little Ice Age, which is not technically a glacial period, but it was a brief cold period that started around 1300 and sort of petered out and ended in the 1700s and 1800s. Prior to that, most of human history is distinctly within an interglacial period. And you can see that as you go down, you see the temperatures rising again. And then when we hit the layers, the levels that correspond to the snow that was deposited during the last glacial period, they call it an ice age here, but this is all within an ice age technically, but you see it drop again. And of course, boreholes are useful to a point because as you go down, you're actually going to start encountering warming from the heat of the Earth on the bedrock that's underneath the glacier, and that's going to kind of erase any data. Remember that cold-based glaciers, like those we find in Antarctica, tend to be warmer at the bottom, actually. Not warm enough to melt very much, but they're warmer at the bottom because the air temperature is so cold, and the heat of the Earth actually does a more effective job of heating them than the air does, because again, it's Antarctica. Now, the other method involves using isotopes, specifically the isotope ratios of elements present within the gas molecules in the air bubbles. And let's talk about what isotopes are. Two isotopes, so an element is defined by the structure of the nucleus or the core of its atoms. And specifically, that is done by the number of positively charged protons. That's the atomic number, like 8 for oxygen, comes from the number of protons that every single atom of oxygen has. Protons repel each other, though. Positively charged particles spontaneously go in opposite directions. And for nuclei to be stable, they need to have particular combinations of numbers of protons and numbers of neutral neutrons, which are about the same size, that will stop the nucleus from spontaneously falling apart. If that happens, that is radioactivity. Radioactive elements, radioactive isotopes are those in which the nucleus just kind of falls apart because it's not stable. And that is useful, actually, because we use radioactivity to study the age of rocks. But we're mostly actually going to be dealing with what are known as stable isotopes. When you have two separate isotopes of an atom, one usually much more abundant than the other, and we examine the ratio between the two. So there's some elements like oxygen that have more than one combination of protons and neutrons that's stable. You have two separate isotopes of oxygen that both have 8 protons, but they're going to have different numbers of neutrons. And these are known as two isotopes of the same element. And one isotope is going to be dominant most of the time. More than 99% of all oxygen is oxygen-16, which is the lighter isotope, with 8 neutrons and 8 protons. But a very small minority of oxygen is oxygen-18, which has 10 neutrons instead. It is stable, it doesn't break down, but it's less abundant. And as for why some are more abundant than others, a lot of that actually has to do with the patterns in which heavy elements made in supernova break down. Statistically, O18 is just less likely to form. But anyhow, it's frequently the case that changes in the less common thing are important. And remember how I emphasized that greenhouse gases are percentage-wise a small part of the atmosphere, but the Earth is really sensitive to even small changes in their concentration. Add just a few ppm of CO2, and you have a really different climate all of a sudden. And the abundance of the less common isotope is often going to be very, very sensitive to changes in the environment. And we employ the ratio of the less common isotope to the more common one because the ratio between the two is actually more useful and makes it easier to compare data from different time periods more easily than looking at the absolute numbers. And that is a scaling issue. Different samples of air might have different numbers of oxygen atoms that are very different scaling wise. One could hypothetically have millions and the other could hypothetically have billions, which would make it hard to compare absolute numbers. But the processes that cause fractionation, as it turns out, separation of the isotopes, apply regardless of the number present. And the ratio between the two isotopes actually shows us what's happening with those processes more than does looking at the numbers. So isotopes are often fractionated by biological or physical processes, meaning that one isotope is more heavily taken up than the other or excluded. And for example, water evaporates and tends to take up the light isotope, whereas a number of other processes, like forming shells or forming rainwater from water vapor, actually tend to take out a lot more of the heavy isotope. And this is simply because a molecule of one of the isotopes has a slightly different mass from the other isotope. And I'll talk about more specifically how this affects oxygen as we go forward. This symbol here is how the oxygen ratio is expressed, and that is the ratio of 18O, which is heavier and less abundant, to 16O, which is lighter and much more abundant. And this is going to be the ratio for a given system, like a lake, or the average for ocean seawater, or the atmosphere. So when using this symbol, you have to specify or indicate clearly somehow what it's referring to. And we'll see it show up in a couple different places, like the ratio of oxygen in carbonate, or the ratio of oxygen in seawater or in glacier water. And right now, for example, the ratio of O18 to O16 in seawater is 1 to 500. So for every one of the heavier, there are 500 of the lighter one. So again, the heavy isotope O18 is a lot less abundant. Now, over geologic time, there's a number of processes that have affected this ratio, that have preferentially fractionated one isotope. And we can thus examine changes in the oxygen isotope ratio over time to infer that some of these things happened. And this is actually one big reason we look at seafloor sediments, to look at carbonate fossils from these phytoplankton. Because if we can reasonably well determine when they were formed, and there's a lot of them, and they can often be found in stacked layers of sediments, so if we can examine them throughout time, we can see how the ratio changes and make inferences about what's happening worldwide, like if glaciers are getting bigger or if glaciers are getting smaller. So, for example, let's consider seawater evaporating into water vapor in the atmosphere. So unsurprisingly, the lighter isotope evaporates more easily, and the lighter isotope will end up being evaporated, and then a lot of it will just be returned to the ocean as it falls back to the Earth as snow or rain. Now, interestingly enough, snow and rain actually preferentially remove the heavier isotope from the atmosphere, which makes sense. If you have to pick to evaporate an atom of one isotope, it makes sense to evaporate the lighter one, and the heavier ones are going to end up in solid form more likely. Now, when organisms make shells, remember, they are building them out of calcium carbonate, and carbonate, like water, has oxygen in it. And we can look at the ratio. This, I don't know why it's so light here, but this shows that you have calcium carbonate forming in the ocean. Now, when organisms make shells out of calcium carbonate, they prefer the heavier isotope because carbonate formation is the formation of a solid. So that removes the heavier isotope from the ocean. Now, we see something different during glacial periods. During a glacial period, we can see the isotope ratio in the carbonate and the phytoplankton change. During a glacial period, less water is available worldwide, and the climate is overall a lot drier. And that's simply because more water that would otherwise be in the ocean actually is locked up in the ice caps. Less water gets returned to the ocean via runoff, and so the lighter isotope gets removed from evaporation, and then a lot of that ends up precipitating at the poles and getting locked up in the glaciers for thousands or millions of years. And the thing is, the water can stay a really long time in the glaciers, especially in these big ice sheets. The light isotopes kind of just get locked up in the glacier. And 18O, the more heavy and less abundant isotope, becomes more noticeably abundant. We see an increase. There's enough. There's just enough O16 being removed that we notice a change in the ratio of O18 to O16. And so O18 becomes more abundant in the ocean during a glacial period, and as a result of this, the amount of O18 in carbonate shells goes up. We see the ratio of O18 to O16 go up during a glacial period because more is available in the ocean, and more gets taken up by organisms like phytoplankton or snails to build their calcium carbonate shells. And this is specifically why we often look at Foraminifera. And this is actually a figure from a researcher who does work on this at UCSB. Dr. Lorraine Lasecki. And I mentioned ocean sediments because they have the fossilized Foraminifera, the type of phytoplankton that build these really pretty calcium carbonate shells. Their cells actually have minerals in their walls to help give them structure. And the carbonate can be analyzed to obtain the oxygen isotope ratio from the oxygen in the carbonate. And if you look at this diagram, this goes from older to younger, from right to left. You'll notice that there's a trend overall towards a higher ratio. You'll notice it goes from 3 at the top to 5 at the bottom, so it's going down like this. Because over the past 5 million years, we've been entering an ice age. You'll notice that the trend overall is towards a higher ratio as you go from the right. But there's also a zigzag pattern that you get from the pattern of glacial periods and interglacial periods. During interglacial periods, you have less ice and more of the water returns to the ocean, so the ratio drops because more of the light isotope that was removed by evaporation gets returned. But then during a glacial period, when the ice sheets expand again, there is going to be more of the light isotope locked up in the glaciers, and so the amount of O18 will appear to go up, and so you'll get a higher ratio. If you look very closely, right up to the present, you'll see that it plummets, and that's because we are in an interglacial period. The ice sheets have shrunk a lot, and so likewise, the O18 ratio in carbonates has gone down because there's more of the light isotope available in the oceans again. And on a separate note, I wanted to mention that you can do a pretty good job also with using surface temperatures, with correlating the ratio of the oxygen present in water with surface temperatures. This can be done with the surface temperatures of ice, and you'll notice that the pattern for the temperature of ice taken from various points on the glacier matches up with the pattern observed in the oxygen isotope ratios. Now, in ice cores, when you drill into the ice itself, the CO2 levels end up being a really useful proxy for global air temperatures. And it turns out that the levels of CO2 in ice cores show a pattern of peaks and troughs that correlates very, very well with patterns of ice volume, represented by the proxy of the ratio of oxygen 18 in calcium carbonate. And you'll notice they're kind of flipped around, like they're flipped around to show how the peaks line up. But what this shows you is that we can trace the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and how it's changed by looking at the bubbles in the ice cores. And we can then follow how the oxygen isotope ratios have changed by looking at seafloor carbonates. And we see that when CO2 levels go up, the isotope ratio goes down because there's less glaciation, and thus more of the light oxygen-16 that's getting released back into seawater. And estimates of temperature obtained from oxygen isotopes show this correlation. CO2 is not the only factor in global climate, but there is a very strong correlation. And there's actually yet another proxy that you can get from ice cores, which I think is cool, and that's from dust. And during cooler periods, the glacial intervals, when there's more ice, there is a lot more dust in the ice layers. And this is because the wind is stronger when it's colder overall, which means that the dust gets blown up more. And worldwide, sea level has dropped, and a lot more water is taken up in the ice caps, which means that there's less water available for precipitation or in atmospheric circulation, meaning that the world is drier and dustier as a whole. There's a lot more of the Earth that is deserts, not just in Antarctica, but elsewhere. And worldwide, the dust blowing in the air, a lot of that ends up being trapped in the glaciers with the snow falling. And the dust contains iron. The electrical conductivity of the ice can actually be measured, and it will go up or down depending on whether you have more iron or less iron. And so we observe strong electrical conductivity during periods of time that it turns out are glacial periods. The increase in electrical conductivity is from the increased amount of iron in the amount of dust present during a glacial period, because the world is just drier because so much of the water is taken up by glaciers. And so I only touched on it and some of the research done, but I hope this gave you some sense of what kind of really fascinating research has come out of Antarctica with climate science. I often get asked if I went there to do climate science, and I didn't, but I think the work done there is really cool. And the second half of this lecture will detail more about what's happening to Antarctica as a result of climate change now. So I'll see you in the second half of the lecture.